The work the SAG Foundation is doing is enormously important. From the up-and-coming actors to the veterans like myself, the foundation is here to help all of us.
As fellow artists, we've all been there. It's crucial that we remember where we came from and help out however we can.
For over 25 years, the SAG Foundation has been the industry's best-kept secret, and we're out to change that.
As natural storytellers, it's great that we have the opportunity to give back through the Children's Literacy Program.
A disaster like Sandy really brings it home with how crucial the SAG Foundation is. Their donation drive helped so many people in need.
The seminars and workshops are crucial. Working together is what makes us better.
The SAG Foundation is a nonprofit organization that relies solely on donations to keep these important programs free for everyone.
The SAG Foundation can't do it alone. We need you.
If you need help, ask.
If you can help, give.
We're all in this together.
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 Together, everyone benefits.
Join the cause. Back now.
Good evening, everyone. I'm John Allen Simon. I'm a member of BAFTA Los Angeles. And Ben Lewin has beat me to the stage in introducing him.
It was supposed to be a grander entrance. Shall I go back? I've forgotten.
You're like a racehorse. Well, have a seat.
Okay.
Before we begin, when Ben is still off stage, I want to thank SAG Foundation, especially my fellow BAFTA member Rochelle Rose and Dennis Baker for their setting this up for us. This is the first time we're doing a joint event of this kind, and I hope we'll be doing more. I'm glad to see so many of you out here this evening, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Ben Lewin.
I'll try and make as many procedural gaffes as I can.
Well, we're shooting video, so we can do as many takes as you like. Well, let's start a little bit at the beginning. You were born in Poland.
Yes.
Guilty? Guilty as
Guilty,
charged?
and I spent a lot of time with my mother.
And an unusual upbringing. Mm-mm. And you moved at an early age to Australia. What prompted the move? And tell us a little bit about your parents, what kind of a household you grew up in.
Well, I was all of 3 years old, but still very persuasive, and I persuaded them that we should be as far away from Europe as possible, because they hadn't had a very good time during the Second World War. And so they were typical displaced persons who had they'd escaped from Poland into Russia during the war. My brother was born in Russia in 1941, probably in one of the worst places to be born in 1941. But they survived, and I was born in Poland when they went back in 1946. And initially, I think my father worked in a coal mining district. And then I guess we looked at, I didn't have anything to do with it really. They looked at all the options, and the typical options at that time for displaced Polish Jews was America, Canada, Israel, Australia, and we had relatives in Australia. So we arrived in Australia with $25.
Wow. And what kind of work had your father done before the war or after the war when you were in Australia?
I think that before the war my father was in the fur trade, I think. Because once I started to question him about what his father did for a living, and he said, he was very religious. So, yeah, okay, but what did he do for a living? Oh, he was a very religious man. And on and on it went. And the best I could find out was that at a certain time he smuggled saccharin tablets from Russia into Poland and made some money out of that, but for the rest of the time he was just a very religious man. My father was also a fairly religious man, but he basically worked as a labourer all his life. I mean, in the early days in Australia, the first job I can remember, he worked on gearboxes at General Motors, at the General Motors plant. And then he worked driving a baker's van for many years. And then he worked in a supermarket as a storeman. He was always just a working stiff. Very nice man.
Now, I know you grew up with a great love of photography and of creative writing. Did that come from your mother? Did it come from school? What were your influences?
It was one of those totally serendipitous things, which I think, one of those little signposts that seems to have marked out life. One of my mother's aunts had decided that I was going to be the child of the month for the Jewish News, a monthly newspaper in Melbourne.
How old were you?
I was about 11, 10 or 11. And there was a photographer who would come out and take pictures for the Child of the Month, which was a charitable thing for the, Jewish women's organisation. And I was totally fascinated by his camera. I don't, just one of those things I became completely obsessed with it. And I had to have one, and my mother said, okay, if you come top of the class, I'll buy you one of those cameras. So I came top of the class, and she figured out that I could come top of the class if I really wanted to. And that was the only camera she ever needed to buy. So she bought me that camera, and I guess I retained a tremendous passion for still photography, well, really to this day, although I don't practice it very much. But I think it became the first kind of, driving creative force. And it was in the days when you took a blank sheet of paper and you stuck it in this liquid and this picture came out, and it really seemed so totally magical. I think that's probably what, triggered that whole path. And I started writing short stories as well. But I never really connected the two. And
never thought about putting the words to the pictures at that point.
At a certain point we did. When I was at university, a bunch of us who were in the camera club got together to publish a book, which we tried to get banned by showing pubic hair, but we didn't succeed in getting it banned. But we did succeed in selling some copies and actually added words to the pictures. So there was, words and pictures. But I mean, it was incredibly.
And a lot of people bought the book just to read the words.
Yes. Like I used to buy Playboy for the interviews.
Yes, exactly. So did everyone, I understand.
Yes. But that was really a very forced marriage, and it was kind of pretentious, but it didn't matter.
Were you a voracious reader?
I was up until I became a real writer. I think at the point that I became a professional writer, I stopped reading in any systematic way. Honestly, I haven't thought about it much before, but when I reflect on it, I think that's what happened. I was a really voracious reader, and then it stopped, and now practically, I read the newspapers and I read scripts, but I'm not like I used to just gobble stuff up for the pleasure of it. I wish I could go back to that time.
What were the books that really impressed you when you were a kid?
The very first novel that really knocked my socks off was Madame Bovary. And I would reread it, every few years.
How old were you when you read Madame Bovary, if that's your
Probably
first?
about 12.
Oh.
12, 13. But, as an adolescent, I certainly remember that, there were elements of it I didn't understand.
What about movies? Were you a movie fan?
Yes, my father was an incredible movie fan. He could remember the plot of movies that he saw in the 1920s.
Wow.
He could tell me exactly who was in them and what happened in the movies, and he used to go to the movies 2 or 3 times a week. I mean, this was in pre-war Poland, and he particularly loved Westerns, absolutely passionate about Westerns. And then when rock and roll was invented, my father, whose father was a very religious man by profession, became a total devotee of Bill Haley and the Comets and the whole rock and roll movement as it began in the 1950s. And I think he used to go and see Rock Around the Clock.
And Rock, Rock, Rock.
Yeah, but Rock Around the Clock was like his that was his way of reading the Bible.
It was a very Talmudic experience. In
Yes,
other words.
yes. And really that revealed a side of my father that was a total novelty, that really had nothing to do with the mundanity of the rest of his life. And he obviously did have this world of imagination that he really privately enjoyed. So my love of cinema began with him taking me to the cinema. I mean, when I was a kid, I was fairly severely disabled for a while, and he used to wheel me to the movies on Saturday afternoons when, they always showed 2 movies. And so I really was a passionate movie lover from as long as I can remember, from 7, 8 years old.
And what were the movies that made the biggest impression on you from sort of growing up? Were they ones that were his favorites, or ones that you saw with friends?
I think when movies really started to make an impression on me was when I realized that there were movies other than American movies. Not to diminish American movies, but when I started to go to university, when I was like 17, 18, there was the Melbourne Film Festival was in its nascence, and there was this Hungarian guy who brought the cinema of Europe to Melbourne, which I had never previously experienced. And I think
the French New Wave, was that?
The French New Wave, the Italian, when I remember one of the movies that really struck a chord with me, and I still remember quite vividly, was by Ermanno Olmi, a very obscure filmmaker. I don't think he's made very much money in his career, but he's made some of the most profoundly impressive movies that I've ever seen. And
he did The Organizer, didn't he, with Marcello Mastroianni?
Did he? That's one I've missed out on. The Tree of Wooden Clogs.
Wooden Clogs, yeah.
And this was a movie called Il Posto, which was about a young... You know the movie?
Yes, I just actually saw it very recently, about the young worker.
Just about a young kid getting his first job.
Yeah.
That's all it was about. And I sat and watched this film with total fascination, suddenly discovering that there were filmmakers who just went out and made movies about real life. There were no cowboys and Indians in them.
And no Bill Haley in the Comets.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as I say, it's not to diminish that, but it was really a discovery when I discovered European and indeed Asian cinema, because along with movies from Italy and France, I also saw Japanese movies.
Kurosawa.
Yeah. And I think that's when I began to appreciate just the diversity of the medium, and that people were saying things and dealing with subjects similar to what I was reading in books.
Now, I assume that some of your life was derailed for a while by your illness, by getting polio as a kid. How old were you?
I was about 6 years old. I guess derailed is one way of putting it. But I'd never thought of it that way. I think my family's life was derailed, and my life was just, beginning to be defined. That I didn't have a life really at that point, and that really began to define the sort of life I would live. But I think it really, threw a spanner into my family's life, into my brother and my parents. I mean, I think it changed their lives forever.
It's interesting. Scorsese and Coppola are two other directors who had polio as kids, and I've read interviews where they've talked about it gave them a sense of isolation, but it also threw them back on their own imagination, creating puppet shows, doing creative things because they couldn't be out playing in the streets with other kids. Was it similar for you?
I guess so, but I think in a way I kind of grew up in that generation where Jewish kids were doomed to play chess instead of football anyway.
Stickball wasn't in your future under
No.
any circumstances.
But this was Australia. It was a very sport-oriented culture, and there was a level at which I did feel left out. But then, I grew up amongst very supportive people. For the first 6 years of my education, I went to a special school, which was a fairly sheltered kind of environment. But then when it came to 7th grade onwards, I was just in the mainstream. And, I pretty quickly adapted to the way other people functioned and did pretty much the same things they did. So, there were differences, there were limitations, but I didn't think that they were substantial. I mean, I found out that adolescence was tough for everyone, not just for me. And I thought it was tougher for me, but it wasn't.
Everyone feels it's tougher for them, don't they?
Yeah.
Now, you trained as a lawyer and became a criminal lawyer for a while.
Yeah.
It seems like you squeezed a lot in before you went to film school.
Well, I don't know. My mother, I think, was a big influence in my life, and by the time I'd finished high school, I wanted to have a literary career. I wanted to be, I think, in my mind, an English professor or something like that, because, I'd become infected with Shakespeare and with the romantic English poets, and really that's where my passions lay. And my mother, somehow, it was very close, but she persuaded me to do law as well. And I discovered that the English course had pretty much nothing to do with creative writing and everything to do with criticism.
Right.
And I wasn't remotely interested in what some guy called Bradley or whatever he was called had to say about Shakespeare. I couldn't give a shit what he said about Shakespeare. And so it was a disillusioning experience studying English because it, as I say, it didn't have any relevance, I thought, to creative writing. And at the end of my first year of law, I'd done my best to flunk out as miserably as I could. I nearly did, and there was a professor there who said, no, you're doing this on purpose. He was on to my game. And he said, no, do the exams again and do them properly. And I did during the summer vacation and scraped my way into the second year of law and found that it was pretty easy. I mean, compared to, real professions like engineering or medicine, you could really just cram in the last few weeks of the year and do whatever you liked for most of the year. And so I got involved in university drama and journalism and this and that and the other, and then put six weeks aside at the end of the year and crammed for my law exams.
Now, I know you were involved with a very famous rights case in Australia involving the Billy Graham crusade, and that kind of led somehow to your going to London to film school. It seems like a very odd segue. I'd like to hear how you
Well, there was in
managed
fact
that.
no segue, but we can create one.
All right. Well, I think I know the segue. It had to do with the Australian Film Commission, didn't it?
Yes, there was a kind of segue. You're right. I mean, I did get involved in some civil rights cases, and this was a very interesting case where one of my favourite clients, who was this was the Vietnam War era. I mean, Australia, in which Australia was heavily involved, and there was a similar sort of social schism in Australia as there was here. And this was one of my favourite clients, and on this occasion it hadn't anything to do with the war. Billy Graham had come on a crusade, and she was at one of the rallies handing out pamphlets and calling out, "It's all bullshit." And Billy Graham was at that time in the care of the federal police, not the state police. And the state police, if they wanted to abuse one of my typical clients, they would charge them with insulting language, resisting arrest, offensive behaviour, and, a whole ragbag of stuff which was all regarded as minor offences. The federal cops really took umbrage and charged this woman with disturbing religious worship, which carried a potential 2-year prison sentence.
It sounds like Pussy Riot, doesn't it, from what's going on in Moscow now?
Yes. In what sense do you mean?
Well, that's what those girls in the rock band who did their protest at a church were charged with.
Oh, with disturbing religious worship?
Yeah.
Oh, well, that's how interesting. But what happened in the end was that we argued that, or we admitted to her behaviour, but said that she wasn't disturbing religious worship. Call it what you wanted, but Billy Graham had nothing to do with religion. We quoted out of his literature that, his name Billy's name relative to Jesus or God in his literature was about 5-1 in Billy's favour. And anyway, at the case prevailed all the way to the Supreme Court. So the only law in Australia relating to Billy Graham says he's not religious worship.
And how old were you when you took this case on?
I was about 23.
And the Australian Film Commission beckoned. How did you get interested in that at that point?
Well, one of my fellow students at law school was a character in Australia who was famous for being a quiz king. His name was Barry Jones, and he was known throughout the country because of he was on this show called Pick a Box, The Money or the Box. I mean, I'm sure that it has its equivalent here, and he was a national figure. And he went to law school at the same time that I did, and we kind of got friendly. And when he went into practice, I remember one day we just bumped into each other in the street, and he offered me a job without my realising it was a job offer. He and another guy who was in advertising, who had the ear of the Prime Minister, and had persuaded him that Australia needed a film industry. And I was earmarked as, there was, 3 wise monkeys were supposed to lead the then Australian Film Development Corporation. and I was going to be the lawyer wise monkey. And there was an accountant wise monkey, and there was a drunk wise monkey. He was
the wisest of the monkeys.
Yeah, he was
no
the
doubt.
chief executive. I was known as a lawyer with the metaphorical half-finished novel in the bottom drawer. You know, someone who was active in the arts and so on and so forth. So it seemed like an ideal job for me, and I was very enthusiastic about it. And then at the last minute, I didn't get the job. It went instead to the son of a Supreme Court judge, whose superior qualification to mine was that he was the son of a Supreme Court judge. And you see, we had learnt some American ways over in Australia. And so the people who had set me up for this job were very embarrassed, and as a consolation prize said, would you like a scholarship to go to film school in England?
So you could get into a business with no nepotism.
Yes, that's right. So, so one day on a Friday, I was still, wig and gown and doing some appeal, and Monday I was at film school in London. And I'd really just moved from one line of show business to another.
And this was the British National Film School,
The
right?
British National Film School.
And
so,
what was that experience like? Was that...
I have a feeling that I kind of, in retrospect, I maybe idealise it too much, but I regarded that time as kind of my halcyon days, and really a totally wonderful experience, and probably a unique one in the tapestry of film school experiences, because it was the first year of the British National Film School. The total student body was 20. There were more staff than students. The director of the film school had been a professor at the UCLA Film School, and he was a Scottish guy, and he'd come back with all sorts of fascinating ideas, one of which was that there was to be no curriculum, and there were to be no teachers. And I thought this was the most wonderful model for a film school, because they were telling you pretty much on day one, if you can't get your shit together by yourself, you really don't belong in this business. And there were a couple of gleaming new Land Rovers, a lot of equipment, better than what I saw later in the business. And we were just, there it was, go and make your movies. And in terms of teaching, we got into the rhythm of hiring whatever teachers we wanted from the industry around us. So I guess my most intense learning experience was when I hired a documentary editor for 6 weeks to help me edit a total mess of a film that I had just shot. And he told me how to turn it into a story.
It was a documentary or a narrative?
It was a documentary, and it was my first film that actually went on television. It was called Dear Mr. Barber, I'd Like to Swim the Channel. And again, it was just an accident. I'd gone with a friend of mine who was intrigued with the Alamo, and he wanted to make a film about the Alamo, and we went to see someone who was supposedly a descendant of someone who was at the Alamo, and blah, blah, blah. And I said to this guy, what do you do? He said, well, I do this, and as a hobby, I train channel swimmers. I said, what's that? He said, people swimming across the English Channel. And so, he showed me a letter he'd just got. Dear Mr. Barber, I'd like to swim the channel. And it was from a 13-year-old Cockney schoolgirl who wanted to be the youngest person to swim the channel. So we got in on this kind of story from that point. And I realized that with a documentary, all you really needed to do was tell a story. Just, treat it as a fiction film, but don't pay the actors. So that was my first a successful foray because it got shown on Thames Television. It was really the beginning of, my working career.
Did it get you a professional job?
It did. It got me, even before it was finished, just an excerpt was shown on a TV magazine show on the BBC called Nationwide. I don't know if there are any British people here who remember Nationwide. And so Nationwide was my first job. Michael Bunce, Sue Lawley, remember Sue Lawley? Yeah, she was a doll. And so that was my first job on this daily magazine show. There were like 20 minutes of news, then 40 minutes of short movies. And the first time I went out, I went out with black and white reversal film. We shot on black and white reversal, and what went through the camera was what went to air. And usually within a day or two of shooting the film. I mean, I got used to this rhythm at film school where it took you a year to make a movie. And there you're expected to turn out a minimum of a movie a week. And sometimes, you'd shoot an item in the morning and it would be on air that night. And it was a real initiation by fire. And also I was working with Fleet Street journalists who were the scum of the earth.
I think the realism of the behavior of the characters in the sessions is one of the reasons for its successes. Do you think stylistically your way of working with actors, what you try to achieve in films, was influenced heavily by your documentary work and by those experiences?
Yes, very much. I think that I made documentaries for a while, and the aim was to always find a charismatic central character who was doing something they shouldn't have been doing, or that was unusual or out of the box. So I always looked for the same emotional content in a documentary and in a dramatic film. So, and I think one of the most interesting reviews that I didn't read all the reviews of the sessions, but one of the ones that I read that was the most interesting, I think New Society. Does anyone still read New Society? No. Said it was secretly a documentary about acting. And I thought, wow, that's really peeled off a few layers of the onion, because I hadn't quite made that observation myself. But then it was a very conscious and very strong decision to shoot this film in as much of a documentary style as would allow. That really we were not setting the actors up to perform within a preconceived shot, but just telling the actors to do the script and we'll film it. So I would say that there's a very simple continuity between my life as a documentary filmmaker and as a fiction filmmaker.
Well, we all know that you were an overnight success in
Yes.
Sundance
Yes.
with the sessions, but before you were an overnight success, there was a little bit of a career. You had 3 other feature films, one with Judy Davis, another with Anthony LaPaglia. Those were done in Australia, right?
One of them was done in France.
Oh, which one was that?
The Favour, the Watch and the Very Big Fish.
With Jeff Goldblum also.
Jeff Goldblum and Bob Hoskins and the late Natasha Richardson and some terrific French actors.
And how did you make the decision to go into features at that point, from documentary and from that other kind of work? Was it something, kind of an adjunct of the fact that you loved writing, the creative writing side of it?
I didn't make any decision to go into features. What had happened was that Well, I did actually. I had a project shortly after I left film school. I started working on this project. It was called The Dunera Boys, and it was an historical film about 2,000 Jewish refugees from Germany and Austria who were locked up as potential spies in England and then shipped to Australia and dumped in the middle of the desert for a couple of years until the British government figured out that they were actually on their side. And it was a very unusual wartime story, which wasn't a tragic story. I mean, it was a story of, fortuitous survival. And it was a story that no one had ever told. And I spent quite a few years interviewing people who'd been through this experience and putting it into, initially we tried to put it into a feature film. Didn't quite happen, and then it became a mini-series, which was probably better. It was not as good for my career, but better for the product. And the producer of that subsequently had put together a feature film, and there were huge tax incentives in Australia at that time, which some people in this audience will be aware of, at least one. And he'd promised a bunch of investors a movie starring Judy Davis.
This was Georgia.
Georgia, yes. And, Judy finally didn't want to do it. So I was the vehicle for persuading Judy to do it after all. I don't know why, but I don't know. Maybe I'm just good with women. But I did persuade Judy Davis to make this film, and so I got to direct my first feature film. The script was a real mess. It was a whodunit, and I didn't know who did it. It was very, very stylish, fortunately, because it wasn't very coherent. But it was a great experience making it. It was a fabulous experience working with Judy Davis. Difficult, but I certainly began to learn that actors can be very unusual people. She taught me many things about filmmaking. One of them was back of head acting, because being very pale-skinned, she was very conscious of lighting, understood lighting, and if she didn't like the lighting and the effect it was having on her skin tones, she would simply turn the other way. And I discovered that she could give just as good a performance with the back of her head as with the front. And I got out of this, TV habit of, having a full frontal portrait shot for every word that's spoken. Found out that in feature films you didn't need to do that. You could have blurry shadows saying things, or the backs of movie stars' heads, and that would work as well. So that was a really good learning experience at the taxpayer's expense.
And, you worked in television as well as these other two feature films. You directed Ally McBeal. Among other things, did you enjoy television compared to features, or how was that for you?
Well, I enjoy working compared to not working.
A common thought.
And I've always enjoyed television. Sometimes it's been very frustrating. I mean, I did a lot of television work in Australia for the ABC, which is the government TV network. And it's almost like working for a charity. So it was frustrating at certain levels. I remember doing a shot where a guy had to open a bottle of wine. I said, okay, take two and need another bottle of wine. I had to go and buy it myself. So, if you wanted to shoot something with a bottle of wine, you got one take and that was all. So there was the frustration of working with very low budgets, very low cash budgets, and working very fast, which was actually a tremendous education, because when push came to shove and we had only so much money to make the sessions, the number of shooting days was pretty crucial to our being able to do it, to say we could do it in so many days. So that I've benefited greatly from television. I've done all sorts of work in television, mini-series, episodic series, documentaries, pretty much everything except light entertainment.
And in fact, the sessions, or the surrogate as it was originally called, kind of began life as you were starting to work on an idea for a sitcom, didn't it? In your research.
Yes.
You were you'd quit writing. You felt it was you'd had a heart attack, and you felt writing was a kind of an unhealthy lifestyle, as many writers.
I thought it was going to kill me, and I didn't want to die in a room alone. I thought, somehow I want to be with other people and attract as much sympathy as possible.
And maybe medical attention.
Yeah. And so I did really step off the writing thing for about 10 years. I really couldn't deal with it, and would do directing gigs as and when I could find them, and the rest of the time I sold watches. And then I thought, I got a really smart idea. I think I send my wife out to work. And so I sent her out to work.
You are good with women.
And I got back into writing. But I was unemployed for a long time, and I think my agent, I think out of a sense of desperation, really said, why don't you write a sitcom about yourself? And so I, created this monster called the Gimp, and he was the sort of character who would have intentional collisions with attractive women in the street in order to be able to guilt them into going on a date with him, and would also trade the use of his handicap placard for sex. He's a real dick of a man, but and it was in the course of. Sounds actually like a good idea when I.
Well, I was going to ask you if you were going to get back to it. We could.
Just thinking, yeah, and really, I was surfing the internet looking for tasteless material for this, and there were these great websites like Gimp Girls Gone Wild, and it's one I'd recommend.
And crutch chicks, things like that.
You've been there too, huh?
Research.
And in the course of this, stumbled across Mark O'Brien's article, and it kind of, it sort of rescued me. And really, I count that as one of those kind of moments that you turn a corner. Something happens that becomes very, very motivating, and I found that reading his article was very, very motivating. So you combine that with a sense of desperation, and you have motion, momentum, I guess. So it was one of the projects where it never seemed to lose momentum, unlike most of the projects that you get involved with. You have a kind of a vigorous start, and then it kind of peters out. And this project didn't peter out. But
Well, there was the story on seeing a sex surrogate that he had
Yeah.
written. He was a poet, and was would you say he was a quadriplegic? Is that no, not a quadriplegic, paraplegic, or no, I guess he was immobile in an iron lung.
he was
in
about
any
as
case.
plegic as you could get.
Multiplegic.
And he had movement, in his head, in his neck. He could apparently move one or two toes occasionally, and his sexual organs were perfectly functional. But he couldn't, he was permanently horizontal and really only had the use of his head.
And he had already passed away by the time
Yeah.
you optioned the material. You optioned
Yeah,
the story.
I didn't know that when I read his story.
It had been written in 1990. Is that right?
It was published in 1990, and it was an account of events in the mid-'80s.
And you went out and found the woman, the sexual surrogate that he had worked with.
Well,
And that was kind of the key to the structure of the story.
it was a very important key, but I think the journey started with the people who had published the article, because I wanted to option the article, and they said, "Oh, the lady there, Sandy Close, said, oh, you need to talk to Mark's girlfriend." I said, "Girlfriend?" And yeah, he had a girlfriend when he died, and she has the rights to his work. This was Susan Fernbach, who was the character at the end of the movie that he meets in the hospital. And so Judy and I drove up to Fort Bragg in Northern California and connected with Susan. And I'd say that very, very sympathetic connection between us was also an important factor in the process. The very first step was not a hurdle, it was a push forward. We left with a signed option. I'm just thinking, we're currently negotiating an option agreement that the amount of money is trivial, but it's been 6 months between the lawyers so far. And I think, God, welcome to Hollywood. But the understanding that we had with Susan was a personal one, and she subsequently put us in contact with Cheryl Cohen Green. And when I went to see Cheryl, it really created a new concept of the script for me, because then I was aware that this was a two-hander, that this was a journey for two very fascinating and both of them complex characters in their own way, and that this would make the story so much easier to write, that I didn't need to go with the rules, if there were any, for writing biopics, that this was a relationship movie, and that was a structure that I felt very comfortable with as a writer.
Did Mark's wife or girlfriend, was she?
Girlfriend, they were never
sorry.
married.
Did any of these people have any approvals on the material, on the script?
Not in any legal sense, but it mattered a lot to me that they approved of the material, and they were the first. Susan and Cheryl, apart from Judy, were the first person to see the script, the first script that I was prepared to put out, and I invited their comments.
Now, I understand that the friend that you brought to see Cheryl with you ended up becoming an investor in the movie on the spot, and that was a big piece of momentum too.
It was. By coincidence, this was an old law school buddy from Melbourne, and he was in San Francisco with his family on vacation, and I had agreed to hook up with him, and I said, "Look, I'm going to meet a very fascinating person this afternoon. Why don't you come along and hang out with me?" And So he sat there and listened, and I think we pretty much thought the same thing going in, namely, what's the difference between Cheryl and a hooker? And in the course of the conversation, you know, amongst many other things that were said, you know, I asked something and she said, look, I don't remember, do you mind if I go and get my notes? So she left the room, and my friend and I looked at each other and notes, and she came back with a file with notes, which were really the basis for the notes that you hear her dictating in the film. And I know that both my friend and I thought at the same moment, hookers don't keep notes.
And if they do, they're for different purposes.
And yes. And I think that, again, he, at the same time as I did, realised that we were dealing with a very unusual character, with a really genuine streak of humanity in her, who was at the same time funny and entertaining. And when we left, he asked me what my plans were, and I said, well, I want to make a movie out of this. And how much would it cost? So I just picked a figure out of the air and I said, oh, I don't know, $1 million. And he said, okay, I'll be good for the first 20%. And although there was no script at the time and no movie to make, I still thought, well, this is even if he doesn't come good on his promise, this is a guy who doesn't go to see art house movies. He just goes to see mainstream movies. And if this subject matter has impressed him to that extent, then in a way I'm getting an early feedback from the audience. And 2 years later, roughly speaking, when I'd finished the script, Julius, you know, my friend, was as good as his word. The Australian dollar was through the roof relative to the US dollar, which was very much in our favour. And the next guy that we went to was a guy that I'd been selling watches to, so I knew he had a lot of money. And he said, how much is Julius in for? I said, 20%. I said, okay, I'm in for 30%. So really with two players, we had 50% of the money. Doesn't mean the rest was just as easy to raise. It wasn't. It was, you know, it was, but you knew that there was a light at the end of the tunnel. You know, at that point, we were pretty certain that we were doing something, that we were not just, so to speak, peeing into the wind. And so I think that we stepped out of the vicious circle of having to find cast before you could find the money, because the only people we approached were too naive to understand that's the way it was done. And they thought, can you imagine that the basis of making a film was a script?
How foolish of them.
So that's how that transpired. It was a period of about, I think, 18 months that it took us to put the money together.
Now, an interesting connection that we have is that we share a producer from the film that I just directed, and from the sessions, Steve Nemeth. And I know you had several producers, including your wife Judy, who came on board. Was all of the money raised privately for the sessions? Was it all private investment? Yes. And how many investors did you have total?
Roughly 25. Was it 25? 29. Okay. Well, they kept growing. I mean, Judy was raising money while we were filming and calling people and no longer asking them to invest, but telling them how much they were investing. So
you're good with women.
Yes, yeah. So was Mark O'Brien, and I think one of the common bonds between me and Mark O'Brien was that we're both very attracted to women. Anyway, I think that was. I don't know how many times one can pull that kind of trick off, because most of the time you take money from private people and you lose it. These people were all truly amazed that they got their money back plus some.
Yes. And had you all the money together before you started casting, or did you start to cast?
Pretty much. But the budget grew. At first we thought we could make the film for about $650,000.
Which is the SAG modified low budget limit.
Yeah. And we thought, yes, we can do that. But, you know, we hadn't anticipated really getting a very classy cast. Not quite as classy as we ended up with. And I think certainly when you're filming the sort of scenes we were filming, the lighting had to be good. I mean, we wanted to make the film look as if we hadn't lit it. And I think in order to do that, you have to light it very carefully and skillfully. So everything started to increase in cost. We had to get a more sophisticated lighting kit, more gaffers, more... so everything, in order to raise the artistic and technical level of the production, it ended up costing us more.
Now, you shot digitally and you used the red camera. Did you ever consider film, or was that just never in the equation for this level project and for what you wanted to do?
I couldn't see the point. I mean, I'm not part of the artistic debate about film versus digital. I mean, I could be, I'm just not. I'd been shooting TV shows where we shot everything digitally, and for the life of me, I couldn't tell the difference. Except you didn't have to stop every moment to say, check the gate, or, you know, wait for someone to say, here in the gate, or whatever they want to say. So I wasn't... you know, I'd worked on a TV show where it took me a couple of days finally to figure out that we weren't shooting film. And so for something where we were not like some movies do, repainting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. You know, we were just making a movie which was mostly two people in a room. I couldn't see the point of working with film.
Now, tell us a little bit about getting those two people in the room. Who was your casting director? How did you come to that person? And how did you end up casting Helen Hunt and Bill Macy and John Hawkes in the three major parts? I'm going to be able to sit back and relax while you tell us that part.
What if I keep it short? Although Judy and I raised the money for the movie, Stephen Nemeth provided us with the connections. And he's a producer that knows everybody knows him, and it was extremely useful being able to, even during the money-raising process, being able to drop names. For instance, he would say to us, look, you know, Peter Fonda's a friend of mine, he'll play the priest if you want him to. Now, the generation that I was raising money from in Melbourne, Easy Rider, you know, it was in our blood. We grew up with it. So Peter Fonda, wow, he's going to be in your movie. No one realized, of course, that you can't raise money on the back of Peter Fonda in the normal business. But it was an interesting, you know, way of helping us raise the money. And when it came to the point of casting, Stephen knew all the casting directors. So we started with Deborah Aquila, who's a big name in the business, but I felt, you know, we could do better with someone smaller. So then he introduced me to Ronnie Yeskel, and Ronnie and I really got on. She cast Pulp Fiction, was one of her very interesting movies, and she took it very, very personally. I mean, the first thing she says was, have you got the money? Because she wasn't going to be interested in wasting our time on a movie where we're looking for the money. And even though we had the money only in the barest minimal sense, that was enough.
It's amazing what a difference it makes, isn't it, when
Yeah.
you're trying to attract cast
Yes.
before you have financing and once you have financing.
Yes, and that was quite an eye opener. That you weren't sort of asking people to help you make the film. You were asking, do you want to be in it? I'm making it with you or without you. So it's an invitation to be in it rather than begging them to help you, and it's a huge difference. And so we were lucky to be in that position. And Ronnie's attitude was, don't take anyone's name off the table. In other words, don't be afraid to go for big names. And there is a danger in that it can chew up a lot of time, because even in a situation where there is good faith and they're not, treating you like nobody, even though when they're taking an offer seriously, it takes time. I mean, it's a minimum of a month to process an offer, even if the actor and their representatives are receptive. We were going through this process. We decided to cast the male lead first, and we started with some big names, and after 3 or 4 rejections, you start to reassess where you are. And one day Ronnie called, and that was when John Hawkes got his Oscar nomination for Winter's Bone, and was totally convinced that this was the guy that I wanted. And to a large extent, I was feeding off her total conviction that this was the guy. And I saw Winter's Bone right away, and I thought, what, that creepy old guy? It's not my image. I wanted the guy to have some sex appeal.
But you'd seen Deadwood too, then, I'm sure. And
then I
seen
went
how
and watched
sweet he could
Deadwood,
be.
and I watched You, Me, and Everyone We Know, and I pretty much watched his whole body of work, or as much of it I could see, and realised what an incredible chameleon of an actor he was. How really you never knew who the real John Hawkes was. And we met and spent a couple of very productive hours together, talking through the role. I mean, one of the things that really touched me about John Hawkes was that, to use a familiar French expression, he was a real mensch. And the very first thing he asked me was, have you approached any disabled actors to play the role? He didn't, he felt bad about the possibility that he would be taking work away from a handicapped actor. And, he accepted my reassurance that I'd been down that road and hadn't been able to find anyone, that really he was the best person for the job. I think I was pretty much convinced after I met him. I think he wanted to mull over it a few days, and eventually came on board, and I really now think of him as a friend. Been one of the most gratifying actor-director working experiences one could hope to have. I mean, a man totally committed. His preparation was as exhaustive as it could possibly be, and yet he would come to set as if he hadn't studied the part at all, as if every day was a spontaneous experience. That was true of Helen too. Both of them prepared incredibly exhaustively, but were prepared to forget all that at the moment.
I'm thinking this would have been a really challenging part for John Hawkes to stay in character, even when he wasn't, between takes and things. Was that possible? Did he try to? Was it?
I think he tried to stay in a kind of cocoon of calmness while he was working, but
Emotionally rather than physically.
Emotionally, yes. And he didn't isolate himself from anyone, and you couldn't tell that he was staying in character, because he'd join us for lunch and he'd be gregarious and so on, but there was a sense in which he was staying in character and trying to minimize the amount of interaction he was having. But he wasn't extreme about it. I mean, he could be laughing and joking with you at one moment, and a few seconds later he'd be a different individual.
Now, there was a documentary, a pretty well-received documentary that Jessica Yu had done about Mark O'Brien. Did you encourage him to watch it? Did he?
Yes, everyone who had anything to do with the movie regarded that as essential viewing, and John, above all people, watched it. I don't know if you could even count the number of times. I mean, he kept, every time he was in his car, he would play the soundtrack in order to keep Mark O'Brien's voice in his head. So he studied that film literally frame by frame, grasping every detail of Mark's physical behaviour and voice, and anything that was there, any detail for him to latch onto. I mean, even last few days before we started filming, he just went up to Berkeley to hang around where Mark lived, just, I guess, to absorb the karma of the situation. So Jessica Yu's film was an incredibly valuable tool, particularly for him.
And I'm assuming that he became very much a collaborator in terms of casting the part of the sexual surrogate with you.
I was conscious that from the moment he was on board that he was a kind of creative partner. And I wanted him to be happy with the rest of the casting, particularly with the role of the surrogate. But it wasn't really his call. Ultimately, it was my call. And I think he respected that. And one of the things that really attracted me about Helen was the fact that they were total strangers to each other.
She and John.
She and John were total strangers to each other, whereas some of the other names we were considering were people that he'd worked with before and had close relationships with, like Vera Farmiga, who, as it turned out, wasn't available. But after I met Helen and began to really like the idea of her doing it and thinking around her, you know, the character evolving around her, who she was. One of the things I liked was that it was going to be awkward between her and John, that there would be this natural awkwardness. And I think that when he realized that, he really went with it.
I don't know how to put this quite correctly, but you know, it seems inevitable now that Helen Hunt played that part, but there could have been a lot of external or even internal pressure to try to cast someone who would be, you know, a sexual turn-on for a large portion of the audience, to make it, not that she isn't, again, I said I'm having trouble with this, but, you know, somebody younger, somebody more conventionally a sexual figure.
There was no pressure in the sense that the buck stopped with us. There was no one there to tell us the realities of the business. So the pressure was only what we felt within ourselves about, who were the alternative choices.
I know at one
And
point
yes.
John had suggested somebody who was
Yeah,
very attractive.
one of the actresses who really wanted to do it, and whose talent I really admired, was Amanda Peet. And when I met Amanda, she was shockingly beautiful, and I went away and thought, I mean, I don't want it to look like I'm casting Marilyn Monroe to play Mother Teresa. That it's, you could do it, but it would be a different sort of movie. That's a really exaggerated way of putting it. But I felt that...
But I think it's accurate, and I think it goes back to, I think that's an apt way of putting it, the feeling that one might have looking at the commerciality of a project like this versus the artistic integrity. And in a way, the artistic integrity proved the commerciality of it.
Well, as you said, that after the fact, that you can't imagine anyone else having done it.
Right.
And I think that I had although it's not necessary to put that kind of definition on a film, I had it in my head that this was essentially going to be a woman's film, that this was going to be it was going to be a female-driven audience that would go to see something that was essentially a powerful emotional ride, or that was the intention, and that from the woman's audience point of view, Helen Hunt was a more inspiring choice. That that she represented that sense of the strong female character, of female independence, whereas I really wanted to step away from any sense that this was going to be a calendar girl. Although one of the movies that was in the back of my mind when people said, well, what sort of movie is it? Well, I would say, okay, it's My Left Foot meets Risky Business. And Risky Business was a kind of reference point in my mind. It was, after all, a coming-of-age movie. Young guy meets a strange woman, and their brief relationship is a life-changing event.
It's an initiation.
Yeah. But I guess at a certain point, which was the casting, I had to recognize the differences between The Sessions and Risky Business. Although there were similarities, it was part of the casting is definitely part of the process of finishing the script and saying, okay, these are the characters I'm talking about.
Well, Helen Hunt has not really been known for doing sexually explicit movies, and she's had a long and distinguished career without having done any heretofore. What kind of conversations did you have with her about how the sex scenes would be accomplished? You told me there was really a collaboration with you and your DP, Jeffrey Simpson. Do you want to talk a little bit about that strategy?
Yeah, although to describe it as a strategy is really flattering. I initially responded to Helen's questions about the sex scenes by being evasive.
A good tactic.
Yeah. Although this was obviously, very prominent in her mind from the first moment we met. And I think that, it had to pass through several levels of getting comfortable, or whatever you want to call it, for her. And indeed for me, but, for me it was a bigger picture of, I've got to figure it out sometime.
It's not like it's a small part of your movie.
No. I forget when it was in our first conversation, but pretty soon she asked, I don't know which question she asked first, but she may have asked first who was the DP, which most sensible actresses do ask. And then she asked, well, how do you propose to do the sex scenes? And I said, well, really just the same way as the rest of the movie. You know, no special techniques, just the way we do the other stuff. And that was kind of enough for the first conversation. And we talked about other aspects of the movie, talked very thoroughly about a whole lot of aspects of the script. And then, again, she wanted to know, how was I going to do the sex scenes? Well, I simply didn't know. As I hadn't, you know, figured out a shot list for the whole movie at that point. But then, you know, the cameraman and I, you know, he lived at our house, and we would pretty much block every scene before we went to shoot it in good time. But
with the actors?
No, just ourselves.
Just yourselves?
Yeah. And, you know, figure out basically how we were going to cover every scene. So, but Helen wanted to know, and that was part of her anxiety. Where was the camera going to be? What incredibly ugly angle were we going to see of parts that she normally didn't display? And you know, we went through one exercise of she asked Jeffrey and I to go over to her house and talk through these things, and asked him to get on the bed, and she would get on top of him this way and get on top of him that way. There were real Kodak moments. I wish I'd taken some pictures then.
We can look forward to those in the DVD outtakes, maybe.
But yeah, somehow it made her feel more comfortable. Particularly, it developed the relationship between her and Jeff Simpson, because when you get down to it, that's who physically the actors are dealing with on set. The director is off in Video Village most of the time, and their mentor, their guide, is the cameraman. And a relationship of tremendous trust developed between Helen and Jeff, so that when it came to shooting scenes, she simply trusted that he was not going to let anything ugly go by.
Did you have dailies?
No. I mean, I got dailies, but we didn't watch dailies.
And you didn't show her dailies?
No. But we had an understanding that she would see a cut of the movie, and I said that if there were any shots that she didn't like, I wouldn't use them. So she did have some sense of control. That, when it came to the point, we did discuss very specific shots and made a couple of changes. But you know, I don't know. I used to get behind on the dailies. I mean, you get the dailies, and I can remember vividly every moment of everything we shot, so I don't watch them anymore.
Yeah, because you're actually seeing the real footage on the set that day. You're
yeah,
not
and you're seeing it on a TV screen, and I think also you're conscious of the dramatic aspects of it, working or not working, as it's happening. And I certainly remember, you know, some of the more emotional scenes in the film, having that emotional feeling as you were watching them being performed. It was not a clinical process, as, you know, filmmaking often is. We would often do things in long takes where the whole scene would be performed, and I could tell that certain people on the crew were getting misty-eyed while we were shooting the material. And so who needed to look at the...
When the Teamsters are crying, you know you may have struck a chord, I think.
Yes. And I guess that there was one particular day that said a lot for me. I think it was a few days into shooting, and I was very worried that our cameraman, Jeffrey, was running around doing the job of several people, because we had a very young crew, and as he pointed out, a lot of the technicians didn't understand the basics of C-clamp technology. And he was running around doing other people's jobs for them, and I was concerned. I said, Jeffrey, are you at least having fun? And he said, I'm having a fantastic time. And I knew at that moment that the reason he was having a good time was because the film was evolving. There was a real movie evolving. So the dailies came in handy when we ran out of money at the end of the shoot and had to seek new investment, and then we could just wheel prospective investors into the living room and show them some dailies, and they'd sign a check.
How many days was the shoot?
I'm owning up to 23. It's like used to fudge, like people lie about their age. I'd say 22 because we could have shot it.
You don't look 22.
No, thank you. I haven't for a while. But we used up 23 days. I could have done it in 22.
Did you have any reshoots?
No, there were no reshoots.
And did you have a rehearsal period beforehand, and how did you use it?
No, we never rehearsed anything. Didn't do any rehearsal.
Did you have a table read?
Nope.
Doesn't sound like you like table reads.
You know, they seem to be a quaint tradition. I remember in the olden days we used to get around a table and read a script, and it was a real event, but who has time for that sort of thing anymore? And also, this is a digital age when you have the ability to capture entirely new moments for the first time, and somehow I felt, okay, let's do it that way. I mean, we are using the best actors in the business. I've got a cameraman who I absolutely trust. Let's just go for it and see what happens. And, there were many scenes in which we used the first take, for most of the scenes. So, I don't necessarily recommend that as a way of working, and sometimes actors really want rehearsal, and I think you have to oblige them. But no one really asked for it.
Did you give the actors, you said you and the DP had worked out blocking. I assume by that you probably meant more camera movement.
Yes, basically we worked out where we were going to put the camera and how many shots we needed to cover a scene.
Did you light generally so the actors had some freedom to move, or did you try to give them their blocking? How did you work on the blocking with the actors?
Well, we would give them as much space as possible. So we would light the room, and then Jeff would really tweak the lighting as we went along. I mean, the actors, well, John didn't go anywhere.
That was a bit of a convenience for you, wasn't it?
Yes, so that was kind of half the problem.
He didn't say, what's my motivation for going to the window?
But we never said to Helen, look, you need to move from here to here. Just, okay, you're going from the bathroom to the bed. Go whatever route you like. I mean, so we would light the room, and if she did something a bit unexpected, then Jeff would sort of tweak the lighting so that it would accommodate what she had done. So there was never any sense that, I mean, of course, there were shots where the lighting was really minimal. She's sitting at a desk. The lighting has come from a reading lamp. You know, she's a director as well. She understands that, you know, if she leans back and the lighting is everywhere but on her face, we're not going to be able to see her eyes. So, you know, in a way, the actors know how to find the light too. It was a mutual process, but we never really sought to restrict their movement when they needed to be moving.
Did you shoot rehearsals?
Yeah, well, there were no such things as rehearsals.
So the first run-through was...
First run through.
You shot it.
Yeah.
And did you use more than one camera ever?
Or? We did on an occasion where, you know, we shot an expensive, you know, singing and dancing Baz Luhrmann type of scene. And then it was never got into the film. It was the most expensive day. We had 2 camera crews and... Anyway, but normally we only worked with 1 camera. And
how did Bill Macy come on board? He's so terrific as the priest.
You know, he came on board because, you know, all of a sudden this became a project that CAA blessed. We were very fortunate in that respect that one of the important agents at CAA really liked this project and was instrumental.
Who was that?
Peter Levine. And we were getting down to the wire time-wise in casting the priest. And I sort of thought I wouldn't mind having a black priest. So we'd gone out to Forrest Whitaker and then Don Cheadle. And then I don't know who called who, but someone called and said, what about Bill Macy? So I don't think we had even a millisecond's hesitation. And I didn't care that he wasn't black. It was really an ideal working experience. I mean, the guy is just such a sweet individual. And... you know, we started in a very workmanlike way by looking through his scenes and you know, talking through them and adjusting the lines and adding a bit here and taking away a bit there. And I mean, that was his first concern, you know, just total professionalism. And then he'd turn up on his Harley Davidson with his ukulele, and he taught our little daughter to play the ukulele on set, and for the most part, he didn't have any problem at all. I mean, it was like I didn't have to do a lot in the church scenes. I was even grateful that there was one day where he seemed to struggle a bit and needed my help. I think it was the funeral scene where he had to wear all this heavy, hot, uncomfortable clothes, and, you know, somehow I felt that he needed me a bit more. But otherwise, it was really like sitting and watching 2 incredible performers doing live theatre in front of you and working for minimum wages.
And he's pretty much, in a way, the audience's point of view for the action, isn't he?
Well, he started. The character started as a real element in Mark O'Brien's story, and when I got to that part in his article where he said, you know, and then I went to talk to my priest about it, and we discussed it, and he said so and so. I said, what? I mean, and I thought this is absolutely essential element in the story to include this, that he wanted it to be a spiritual thing as well. And as I was writing successive drafts, one of the things about the first draft that really shocked me when I came back to read it was how explicit the sex was. And some of it really made me cringe. And I thought, okay, if we move some of this detail out of the bedroom and into the confessional, then it becomes funny. And so it was a way of revealing the same technical information without grossing the audience out. And so that became part of the priest's function, and also to be a kind of chorus. Yes.
Well, tell us about after finishing the film, getting into Sundance, and you guys got the big ticket out of Sundance last year, where Fox Searchlight picked up worldwide rights for $6 million. That must have been a pretty heady, interesting experience to have your little independent film get that kind of attention. And
Yeah,
get that
I remember
kind of
it was
a
one of
deal.
the kind of romantic moments in our life, actually, kind of going back in the taxi in the snow, in this complete whiteout with Judy, and just sitting in the back seat, and we've got this piece of paper on our laps, and on the front it says $6 million. And it was a truly romantic moment. I think that, yeah, probably Sundance was a very critical element in the whole story.
Talk a little bit about getting into Sundance. How did that work?
I think it worked because quite early in the process, I think Stephen Nemeth particularly was saying this is a Sundance movie. We didn't really know all that much about the festival scene, and took his word for it. And before we knew it, he was bringing Sundance selectors onto the set while we were filming and creating an interest on their part in the movie at that stage. So by the time we were ready to apply to get in, they were saying, look, we'll give you a bit of extra time so you can, clean up your soundtracks a bit. And you already felt that it was a kind of a sympathetic and potentially proactive relationship. And I felt that they really embraced the film beyond what you expect a festival, festival selectors to do, really wanted to help it succeed. And I think they did everything to make the result possible. I think they gave us a good slot. I think that Monday midday slot in the Eccles Theatre is now regarded as a kind of a lucky slot, and people want to have it. I think that that experience of the way it was received there, which was the first time we'd ever showed it to an audience, and imagine how Helen Hunt must have felt. All these people were going to see every inch of her, and how would it get? Anyway, it went down pretty well. And then the hours that followed when the bidding war went on, and we had been told that none of this was going to happen. It was all from the old days, and this kind of stuff didn't happen anymore, and it happened.
Which were the other companies in competition for the picture?
Well, I don't really know. I know that Harvey Weinstein was looking at it privately, and that I remember getting a call from the Samuel Goldwyn Company as I was leaving the theatre, and the others. CAA were our sales reps, and we had a lawyer, and they were getting all the offers. And I just remember at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon there was some strategic meeting, and all the different players were laid out on the table, and I don't remember who they all were. And it was felt that Fox Searchlight were making the most serious overtures and probably would come out with the biggest numbers. And they wanted to be preemptive. They wanted to knock the other. So while negotiations were in progress, we were reading on the internet that the deal had been done. and we're looking at around ourselves to say, who's the mole? Who's leaking this? In fact, it was Fox Searchlight. who wanted to frighten off, any other...
With disinformation.
Yeah. We were also overwhelmed by their enthusiasm, how much they, but, it had been a good sales wind-up, I would say that our sales reps had done their best to make sure that all the right people were at that screening.
And funnily enough, you were telling me that you had a little bit of the situation with the producers, like Zero Mostel and the Mel Brooks movie, where you had to go back to them because there was a slight wrinkle in the deal if you were going to be making a profit.
Yes. I mean, we were really unprepared for that.
As well, you should have been.
And at the end of the production, really our financial records were in a mess. I mean, our production management hadn't been as diligent as it should be. And I guess, Judy and our daughter Alex, to give her due credit, put all the pieces of the mess together in a legitimate and plausible form. I mean, it's all very, it's really convenient if you make a low-budget independent movie and it's a flop and then you don't have to account for a penny. But after Sundance, we had to account for every penny. And there were some glitches in the paperwork, and we had to go back to investors and say, look, we said this and we should have said that. Would you mind signing off to that? Thank you very much. And and it was a lot of hard work. At first we thought, there has to be a kind of a role model for what do you do in the case of a low-budget indie movie making a profit. And we couldn't find a role model. And so we really had to make up the protocol as we went along.
Well, I've run out of questions. I understand the audience has written some down. What's your best advice for directors when working with actors? What kind of advice do you give young directors or even older directors?
Well, I particularly try to discourage from young directors coming into the business at all, because I regard it as taking the bread out of my children's mouths. For older directors, look, one of the interesting experiences of the whole thing was actually meeting other directors, which I very rarely get to do.
And directors rarely get to see each other work.
Yeah, and I found I actually was getting into discussions with other directors about it, how they worked. I had a very interesting discussion the other day with Judd Apatow, whose work I admire. And he's a bit like Mike Leigh in England. He gets the actor first, has a general idea, and then works with the actor to turn that idea into a real character, into a real narrative, and doesn't seem to be able to do it another way. In other words, I've never worked that way at all. It's always been create the character and then, try and get a bunch of actors to beg you to play it. But really give the character a life of his or her own, and have it all on the page, so that the actor really doesn't need to know much more than what is written there. And at best, the director is a kind of, referee. I'm never quite sure when I go to a symphony concert what's all that about? Who needs it? And if he suddenly dropped in a faint, the orchestra would probably keep playing. And I sometimes think of directing as a little bit like that you can remain pretty much silent most of the day and the film will get done. I like to think that all the work is done beforehand, that you discuss the text and make sure that you both see the same meaning in the text. And then the way the actor says those lines is up to the actor. If I want it different, I'll ask for it different, but I don't presume to tell an actor how to say lines.
Do you go and talk to them in the morning before the day's work? Do you go into the makeup trailer and talk to your actors?
Yeah. Usually I see them at breakfast. But yeah, we talk to before
the day's work.
Sure, but usually not about work.
What about the casting process when you're casting the smaller parts? How do you like to do that? Do you like to get it put on tape and then you look at?
Yes, these days it's all automatically put on tape, and at the end of the day you go home and it's out there online in cyberspace. Every audition you've done that day, and we do our auditions. And usually, you when you're auditioning, you do like 20 a day, and it becomes a blur. And you really do need to go back and revisit those auditions and see who did what and who you might want to see again, or who you think, wow, that person does it for me. So it's pretty much that process. I mean, for the leading characters, I don't ask them to audition. I didn't ask John or Helen or Bill to audition. They have a known body of work. I can go and look at it.
But for the smaller parts, when actors come in, did you do a lot of casting for the supporting parts?
Yeah.
And do you always give actors adjustments when they come into audition, or not necessarily?
I try to empathise with the actors, because it really has a kind of a meat market quality about it. They come for auditions, there are a bunch of other actors lined up, they each get a few minutes at best. I try to humanise the process a little bit. I don't need to hear how many different ways they can say one line, but typically they want to show you. So I ask them, well, why don't you try it this way? And, oh, that was very good. So to some extent it's a bit of a charade to make the actors feel as if they're being appreciated. But typically you can tell, within the first few syllables. And I don't know. I mean, I'd hate to think that I'm, judging people very superficially, but really if someone really fits the part, it's evident very quickly. And I don't necessarily need to know how versatile or flexible the actor is.
And another question from the audience is, with the benefit of 20/20 hindsight, would you have done anything differently in your career? But I'm going to extend the question to ask also, in terms of this movie, is there anything that I mean, it's hard with all of its success to think you should have done something differently and how terrific it turned out. But is there anything that, you kind of, just from that perfectionistic artistic point of view, you wished were
would have done differently in my career?
Well, in your career or in the sessions.
Well, I don't know what I would have done differently with the sessions. I mean, why mess with something that appears to have worked?
That was, my point on that.
In terms of doing things differently in my career, boy, where do we start? I know that, we have a son of 21, and he asked me at a certain point, caught me by surprise. Well, what do you think I should do with my life? And boy, wow. So the first thing I could think of was, I think you should learn to flip real estate and then do whatever the hell you like. And I wish I'd taken that advice myself, because I would say for most of my career, I confused the idea of having a career with making a living. And I don't think the two necessarily have much to do with each other. And I guess that if I had anything to do again, I'd sort of recognise that fact and try and take care of the making a living part in a more logical way.
To become your own patron for the artistic part.
Yeah, to have to have something on the side, and I know that there's an Australian filmmaker who I remember when I was at university with her, and she was flipping real estate when she was a freshman, and later went on to become a very successful and prolific filmmaker. I'm sure it helped a great deal that she could feed the kids at the same time.
Your next project, we're told by IMDb, is a movie called A Moment to Remember with Katherine Heigl. Could you want to tell us a little something about that? And you didn't write that script.
No, I didn't write it. I probably will end up tinkering with it. It was a script that I responded to because, damn it, I was crying at the end of it. I thought, oh, I feel ashamed of myself, really, were you talking about this? The sort of make them laugh, cry, or be scared?
Yes.
And
that's my new theory, my theory du jour.
Well, it's a pretty sound theory because, if you take an audience on an emotional journey, they feel that they've got something out of it beyond just information or entertainment. Anyway, this Moment to Remember story is about a very young woman. I mean, it's based on a Korean movie, and she's 27 in the Korean movie, who thinks she's pregnant and then finds out that she's got Alzheimer's. And it's a very intense and dramatic story. And I thought, well, yeah, I mean, all that Katherine Heigl essentially needs to do is to break the audience's heart. And I think she can do that. I think she's a very gifted actress, and I think this is an interesting bridge, maybe for me, between an artistic film and a commercial film, because there are elements of it which are kind of like a Nicholas Sparks movie, if you like, but I'd like to make it a Nicholas Sparks movie which is more classy and not with the same kind of cliches. So it's potentially a very powerful and effective story. I think it's a very relevant subject as well. And I hope it comes off, but it's, I went out looking for a director for hire movie so that we could avoid the grind of having to be responsible for every nut and bolt and piece of paper and so on, and I could just go and do my thing. But it also means that other people are controlling the essential elements, not me.
Well, John Huston had a saying, one for them and one for me, so maybe that'll be the pattern for you going forward, because I know you have more stories to tell, and we know what a terrific job you do at getting actors in general, and women in particular, to do it your way. Thank you so much.